as you can see, is titled Ilium's Illicit Bride, Helen of Troy and Ideas of the Bronze Age Woman. So Helen of Troy is a character who, if you don't know, is defined by her beauty, right? She's a mythological character, but she has very real implications in how her character has been perceived throughout the generations. Christopher Marlowe, in a 1604 play, or a play that he wrote in 1604, describes her as the face that launched 1,000 ships and burned the towers of Ilium. And so even then, her character is being limited down to her face. In addition to this, Betty Hughes, in her book on her, Betty Hughes is a historian, the title being Helen of Troy, Goddess, Princess, Whore. And I included that as a quote because, because I really think that those three titles embody three different parts of Helen as a divine being, a princess representing Bronze Age royalty, and also known for her promiscuity. And you can see two depictions of her up here from 1898, and the other from Evelyn de Morgan and Antonia Canova. And as you can see, they're different representations, but she is usually shown with long golden hair, although her presentation is going to differ depending on the era of the artist. Which brings me to my research question, which is what can the stories surrounding Helen of Troy reveal about historical women of the Bronze Age? So I really wanted to look at, and I was working with Dr. Fox at, I was like, I really want to do Helen of Troy, but I need to make it a history project that incorporates English and not an English project that incorporates history. So I looked at different pieces like the Iliad, like Euripides' play Helen, and things like that, to look at what we can learn about the real women who are often forgotten through the fictional stories of Helen. I do want to give a brief overview of the area we're going to be talking about. I'll come back and reference these maps, but this is the classical Mediterranean, about 800 to 500 BCE, which, if you don't know, time goes backwards in the BCs because it's like negatives, basically. So negative 800 is farther back than 500. But where we're going to focus is over here. As you can see, Egypt is down here, and I'm pointing that out because Egypt will come up a couple different times. But Greece broadly is going to be over up there, and we'll zoom in on that in a second, but along with Anatolia. But as you can see, you're relatively close to Egypt and what will later become Italy. But compared to other areas, there's a lot going on over there, and so it's all very interconnected. And then we zoom in, basically, and the three areas I wanted to point out here are, I put stars on them, Sparta, which is down here in Laconia, Athens, which is up there in Attica, and then Troy, up near the Hellespont in Anatolia. So as you can see, within Greece proper, Sparta and Athens are two of the big players, but they are relatively near each other. But to get to Troy, you have to go past Athens and vice versa. And I'll come back to these. But just to give you an idea, when I'm mentioning all these places, where they are. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over Helen's whole story, which is very hard to do with mythology, but I wanted to touch on it. So first, her birth, obviously. Helen is born from an egg, which is interesting. Although all people are born from eggs technically, she's born from an egg like a bird. And this is because her dad is Zeus, king of the gods, and he specifically is a sky god. And he comes down to her mother. In some versions, it's the goddess Nemesis, but usually it's a mortal woman named Leda. And he comes down to her in the form of a swan, because he's enraptured by her, whatever, as Zeus does. And he does this a lot if you know anything about mythology. And so she gives birth to eggs, and from those eggs comes Helen, her sister Clytemnestra, and then their twin brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, or Pollux. Usually, Helen and her sister are just referred to as sisters, and the other two are referred to as twins, even though they all were born together. Sometimes they have different parentage, depending, because also she slept with her mortal husband. Yeah. But Helen is always referred to as the daughter of Zeus. I mean, she's called the daughter of Tyndareus, but genetically she's the daughter of Zeus. She is semi-divine, which is notable because you don't have a lot of semi-divine women. You have a lot of heroes who are kids of gods, but you don't come across that very often in mortals with women. One of the major stories of her childhood is her kidnapping by Theseus, so slight spoilers for that. But basically, Theseus, if you know, he's the guy who goes and slays the Minotaur and then leaves the girl who helps him with that on an island and marries her sister. So we don't like him. And so Cece and I call him a piece of shittiest. Anyway, so when he's like significantly older, he also is the founder of Athens. And this is important because, like I said, Athens and Sparta are relatively near each other. So there's a lot of interaction between them as the two powerhouses. And when Theseus, as an older man, like he's described as being older, decides that he wants to get with the young Helen. And when I say the young Helen, I mean she is a child by ancient standards, not just by our standards. The ancient sources usually put her between 7 and 12. So gross. But he kidnaps her and takes her back to, I meant to stay on that slide, sorry. Takes her back to Athens, where she stays until her brothers come and rescue her while Theseus is away trying to kidnap another woman. But anyway, so that plays into the tensions between Athens and Sparta, but that is kind of one of the founding moments of her childhood. Once she is an adult, she has a bridal contest, which would have been quite common for women of royal status of the age. And coinage hadn't yet been invented, so what this entailed is the bringing of gifts, lots of luxury gifts, in order to pay the bride price and kind of to bribe her dad into choosing you. But there's also an athletic contest portion of it. Think like Brave, kind of, even though those are very different periods and cultures. But there's an athletic contest, and whoever wins, plus if you have the favor of Tyndareus, her royal father, determines who gets to marry her. There were many, many suitors at this thing because she is renowned for being the most beautiful. And the winner ends up being this man named Menelaus. And Menelaus, his brother competes in his stead, and that brother marries Helen's sister. We'll come back to that. But she marries Menelaus. But what's also important about this bridal contest is that Odysseus has the idea, which Odysseus of the Odyssey, he is known for being very clever and having the help of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and he comes up with the idea that he's like, okay, people are going to be mad if they don't win. So we're going to create a pact that, like, everybody wins fair and square, no takebacks, like, we're going to defend whoever wins Helen's hand, and nobody's going to try and take her, which will come back to bite them in the ass. But that's what's agreed on, and Menelaus wins. We're going to step away from Helen for just a second to talk about the judgment of Paris. So there was this wedding amongst the gods. All the gods were present, and the goddess of strife, Eris, throws in this golden apple, and it has inscribed on it, "For the fairest," or the most beautiful. And 3 goddesses each are like, "Oh my God, this is for me," but they can't agree who it's for, so they ask Zeus. And Zeus is a little baby and doesn't want to choose between them, because it's his sister wife, Hera, queen of the gods, his favorite daughter, Athena, and the literal goddess of sex and beauty, Aphrodite. So he's like, oh, guys, I can't pick. Go ask this mortal random man, Paris. And Paris is actually a prince of Troy, but he's been exiled because there was a prophecy that he was going to burn down Troy. So he's living as a shepherd, whatever. So they go and they ask him, and they each offer him a gift. And Aphrodite, again, the goddess of love and sexuality, offers him Helen of Troy as his prize if he picks her. So he's like, of course, dude, done. And so she gives, in some versions, she like puts kind of a spell on Helen, and others she makes Paris really attractive. And Paris goes to Sparta while Menelaus is away and pays like a pseudo bride price because he would bring gifts as a guest. And semi-willingly, dubiously willingly, brings Helen from Sparta back to Troy. So again, we're going from Sparta. He would have gone all the way up there from Troy down to Sparta and then back. Which if you remember, they all made that agreement not to mess with the marriage, so now what do they all have to do? Go fight. So every single man who was there has to bring his entire country and army to Troy now, and they fight for 10 years. And it's kind of a stalemate until the final year. But the point that we're going to focus on is the Trojan horse. And you've probably seen this in movies like Mr. Peabody and Sherman. It was not, I love that movie, but it was not a real event. Like the Trojan War, guys, in the way that we think of it, it did not happen. But the Trojan horse basically, like I said, they've been at a stalemate for a long time. And the Greeks are like, okay, we're going to come up with this great plan. And Odysseus / Athena comes up with it, whatever. They create this big wooden horse, right? And then they make this, they make their camp look like they've left. They look like they've gone home. They even have one of the guys like go to the Spartans and, go to the Trojans and it's like, they left me behind, like, oh no, like, they really get into it. But they leave this giant wooden horse that's hollow inside and all the soldiers are hiding inside. And the horse is supposed to be an offer to Athena. And so the Trojans, not wanting to be disrespectful, are like, okay, we're going to bring this into our city. So they bring it in, and then what do you know? There's Greeks inside, and they get it, and they burn down the city, and they win. Spoilers. But what's interesting about this is, one, that it leads to the fall of Troy, but also that Helen does have a part to play in this. When they bring the horse into the city, or even beforehand, Helen has this sort of intuition, sometimes she knows and sometimes she doesn't, that there are Greeks inside. And so she circles around the horse, knocking on the wood, and she imitates the voices of their husbands, their wives. And she does it so convincingly that a lot of them are like, oh my god, my wife that I haven't seen in 10 years and also isn't even here. I'm gonna go out of the horse. And it's Odysseus who's like, do not get out of the horse, guys, you're gonna blow our cover. But she does this so convincingly that she almost saves the city. And then there's different versions of what happens to her after she leaves Troy, but her death, she does not get a peaceful death, unfortunately. In a lot of the surviving stories, she is murdered. There are different versions of this, but both times she is murdered as she is being held responsible for the deaths of men at Troy. They're like, this war was your fault, so we're going to kill you because you killed all of these men. After which she is deified, made a goddess, and worshipped alongside her brothers, which we will touch on. Which brings us to ancient Greek wives. So some of the surviving sources that we have for ancient Greek wives include court records, speeches, archaeology, and literature. Although a lot of these aren't in their voices specifically, they do give us an idea of what these women were experiencing. One of the historians from the period, Xenophon, talks about this idea of separate spheres. He doesn't call it that, but that's kind of what we call it, based on later notions, which is this idea that women were part of the domestic and private sphere. So they were supposed to take care of the home, the slaves, the raising of children, things like that, while men deal with the public sphere, so that being like battle, politics, like more public occupations, all of that. And while they were both important, there was still a rise of men over women, but partially just because public over private more so than sex. There's also a connection of identity with domestic labor, and what I mean by this, one example of it is the grave items that people were buried with. So a lot of times soldiers were buried with their weapons, especially if they died in battle, because that was a large part of their identity. Women were buried with domestic items. You would think maybe they'd be buried with like jewelry or things like that. A lot of times they were buried with spindle whorls, which is like a weighted thing to help with the weaving, or like cookware. And so not only was it a big part of their daily life, but it also then is supposed to be brought with them to the afterlife because it's so ingrained in them. In addition to this, women are regarded as legal minors, meaning that they operate like children, they are under the protection of their father's husbands, and so they do have rights, they just are not autonomous in the same way that full citizens would have been. And again, we're talking about wives here, and so they aren't citizens, but they're also not full slaves either. There's a lot of nuances between different classes of women. And then lastly, there's a presentation of women as inherently corrupt. This is similar to, if you know anything about like Christian mythology, the idea of like Eve as bringing original sin into the world. There's a Greek story about Pandora releasing literally all the evils of the world into the world, but she leaves hope, so we have that. But it gives this idea that women are inherently evil and they're not to be trusted, and they're conniving bitches, and you know, sorry. But and then women and worship through religion. A lot of women were able to gain a kind of autonomy that they didn't have in other aspects of their lives. Excuse me. And so they were able to gain like a quasi-masculine status. And priestess was the only public office offered to women. And one example of this is the Pythia. And the Pythia was a priestess at the Oracle of Delphi, which is sacred to the god Apollo. Basically, you would go there for a prophecy if you had any questions about why can we not have kids, what should I do about this, should I go to war with this country, things like that. And the Pythia was supposed to speak the words of Apollo, the prophecy, like through her. So she would go into a trance-like state, and then in this way, she was able to influence these things in kind of a backdoor way because she had the words of the gods through her. And then common women who weren't priestesses were able to participate in festivals such as the Thesmophoria, which was a festival for Demeter and Persephone, which celebrated the coming of spring and the seasons and the harvest. And then there's this connection of women with fertility as well. And this ties back to the worship of Helen specifically, because while Helen would have been worshiping these goddesses as well, she also, like I said, upon her death is deified. So she is worshipped sometimes alongside Menelaus, because sometimes he's made a god because he marries her, but a lot of times it's alongside her brothers. And so she protects sailors, they're also horsemen, but she also is a goddess of beauty. So there's a story that one of the historians writes about her making an ugly baby pretty, and girls would bring gifts to her as you would to other goddesses, and they would do it as symbols of leaving girlhood behind. So a lot of times they would bring like their clothespins that they would wear with their dresses when they were little to symbolize, we're not wearing this anymore, we're becoming women. So there's also this connection of Helen and the worship of her through the different stages of your life. Which brings us to the women of Sparta. Sparta is a little bit weird in the sense of Greek city-states because it is characterized by its strength, both for men and women. So there was an accentuation of exercise, and there was state-mandated education for men and women outside of the home, or excuse me, boys and girls outside of the home before the Agora system later. However, both of these things were focused on the forming of warriors and mothers. So it was less about equality of the sexes and more so, we're going to educate your mind, build up your body so that way you can bear strong citizens. In addition to this, the birth of girls was more highly regarded than it was in other areas. And what I mean by this is, if you had a girl, it was less of like, oh my god, this is a burden on my family, and more of, okay, we can raise her up to be an asset to us. And part of this is probably due to the close association of Sparta with Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, and Artemis, who is also a goddess of childbirth, but also is a protector of young girls. Women in Sparta had compulsory education in society, both in religion, but also at religious festivals, in the theater, and in athletics. And actually, when Theseus is said to see Helen and want to kidnap her in her child form, she is either dancing with her girls, like as young women do in a religious state, but also, or she's exercising naked in public, also as the girls do. So she's participating in one of these, supposedly when Theseus is like, ah, that one. And in addition to this, Helen would have been held to these standards, especially so because she was a princess. So she would have been doing this the same way that the real women would have. And the conclusion that I got from all of this was that the judgment cast upon Helen reminds audiences both past and present that the women of the Bronze Age and classical Greece should be faithful wives and mothers, but also that they, especially in the case of Spartan women, were forces to behold in their own right rather than wilting, inconsistent sources of children, money, and labor. And yeah, Helen can encapsulate all of this. And then, yeah, any questions? Thank you.